So, welcome back everyone. Our third and final speaker, last but certainly not least, is from New Zealand, Mary O'Hagan, who will be introduced to us her Wellbeing Manifesto, which marks a peer-led paradigm shift in the delivery of mental health services.
Kia ora koutou. Do you know what that means? It is a Māori word and it means greetings to you all. And today, first of all, just to let you know, I come from a lived experience perspective. I had mood swings when I was a young woman. And I was in the mental health system for about 8 or 9 years. And they told me, the psychiatrist said to me, you have a biochemical imbalance, you have a serious mental illness, and this will affect you for the rest of your life, and you will never be able to have a career like you thought you would, and you should think carefully about having children, because you will pass your genes, your bad genes, onto your children. And one of the great pleasures of my life has been proving them wrong. So I got out of that system before the age of 30. I have not had a mood swing to speak of for many, many years. I no longer take treatment. I have 3 children, and that none of them have mood swings, and I have gone on to have a very interesting career. So this gives me a lot of pleasure to have proven them wrong. Now today I'm going to talk to you. So we started, the first speaker had a very narrow lens on genetics, and the second speaker broadened the lens out to talk about the importance of people's experiences and some examples of the conditions that actually have an impact on whether those experiences are good or bad experiences. I'm going to go even broader than that and talk about how do we create a whole system where people who have mental distress have the best experiences and outcomes possible. Because we have a system now that gives us terrible experiences and terrible health and life outcomes. And we need to do something about this. So in New Zealand, haere mai means welcome. So welcome to all people with distress and addiction. So the Wellbeing Manifesto is really about how do we provide a broad range of responses for people who experience mental distress, and how do we make sure the door is open so that they can choose when and where they receive or get those responses. And you see the word whānau there. Oh, the green one. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. You see the word whānau in there, W-H-A-N-A-U. This is a Māori word, and it means my extended family or the people who are important to me. It's not necessarily my biological family. So you can see the menu there that we are proposing of a whole range of supports that people with mental distress can get. So just to start, we are now in the northernmost capital of the world, and I live in the southernmost capital of the world. It is called Wellington. It's a little bit warmer than Reykjavik, but there's a lot of sea underneath New Zealand, and the first bit of land you get to, or ice, is called Antarctica. So we're very much on the edge of the world, like Icelanders, but on the other side. Now, here's something that interests me. We both have quite young female prime ministers, and they almost look like sisters to me. And our Prime Minister, we think our Prime Minister's lovely. We like our Prime Minister. I've never in my whole life had a Prime Minister that I felt so good about. Usually I don't like them much, but so that's another thing we have in common. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about New Zealand because I'm talking to you about a whole system change in New Zealand. We have 4 million people, 4.7 million. 15% of those are Māori, who are the indigenous Polynesian people. They settled actually after the Vikings came to Iceland, so quite recently. And the Europeans came from the early 19th century. We have a parliamentary democracy. Our main industries are agricultural and tourism, and we have a taxpayer-funded health and social services, probably very much like you do in Iceland. We don't follow the American model, we follow the European model. So I want to tell you a little bit about mental health and addiction services in New Zealand. So it's taxpayer-funded. 75% of the funds go to government-run clinical services, and 25% goes to NGO community support services. This is very high on international standards to have 25% of the money going to community support services. I believe more money should be going into community support services. Other sectors, but we have other sectors that provide for people. We have social welfare, corrections, education and employment as well. So, I want to talk a little bit about the background to the Wellbeing Manifesto. So in 2017 we got a new government with a new Prime Minister that I just showed you, and part of the election campaign were people saying there's so many people who can't get help who have mental distress. We have a high suicide rate. The government needs to do something about this. So the government said we're going to have an inquiry into mental health and addiction, and that inquiry reported back a year ago, nearly. And we, in response to that inquiry happening, we said we are going to create a Wellbeing Manifesto as a submission to that inquiry, to say this is what we want you to construct in your recommendations. And there were about 100 peers and people who supported us who had input into this manifesto. And I'm going to talk to you about what's in that manifesto. But before I do that, why did we want to do a manifesto? Look, we think that a system that is dominated by psychiatry has done routine harm to people. Now, it has done some good to people, but it's also done routine harm. And by routine harm, I mean not just ethical lapses or bad practice by a few, but by the routine practices that go on within psychiatry. And we think that psychiatry has not delivered good outcomes for people. We die up to 25 years younger. They give us medications that shorten our lives. We are socially isolated, and we have, in many countries, up to 80% of us are unemployed. Now, psychiatry can't do much about that because psychiatry has a very narrow focus, and we need to broaden the focus so that psychiatry is one of the spokes of the system, of the wheel of the system, but not at the centre of the system. So I was very influenced by what I call the MAD movement or the survivor movement, and we protested a lot, and the woman in that picture is a woman called Judy Chamberlain, who I think came to Iceland. She died some years ago, and she was very influential in my life, and so we're saying this is not good enough what psychiatry delivers. It's very damaging. So we need to create a new way of doing things. So what are the key messages in the manifesto? So, well, the problem as we understand it, is that we call it big psychiatry, and it sits at the hub of the system. It shapes the worldview, it uses most of the resources, and it does harm, because we have coercion, we have institutionalisation, we have a profession that has a very narrow view of people who come through the door. You have a biological brain disorder. The only tools we have are drugs, locked doors, and coercion. Now that is a very limited range of tools. They're expensive services. I mean, building hospitals and everything is pretty expensive. In my country, people couldn't get into services when they wanted to, but then when they didn't want to, they were forced into them. And you know, people had poor experiences in services. They hated them. I mean, we have these wards, acute wards attached to general hospitals. The people, they are very unsafe places for people. They are warehouses where you put people in that you don't know what else to do with. And even the staff hate working there. And so do the people who are often forced to go into those places. And as I said, there are very poor outcomes. And it's a scandal, the poor outcomes that we have. And we need a radical solution to create better outcomes for people with mental distress. So now I'm going to talk a bit about, we need to move from big psychiatry to big community. And what is the difference between big psychiatry and big community? Well, I'm just going to, you read on there. So in big psychiatry, you have a mental disorder, and it is all a deficit. It is all bad. But in big community, we think about mental distress, and we say this is a recoverable disruption to life. It is an experience it is a very difficult experience, but it's an experience that we can learn from and move on from. In big psychiatry, the only way you can get help is through an entry point that is led by medicine. But in big community, we need many ways to get help when we are experiencing distress in many sectors and communities. Now, in big psychiatry, most of the resources go for what I call pills and pillows, medicines and hospitals and clinics. But in big community, where we need to go to, we need resources for a much broader menu of services and supports. Now, in big psychiatry, the people who are paid to be there are mainly medical and allied professional people. But in big community, we're proposing an equal mix of peer support workers and peer workers, people with lived experience, of cultural workers, because this is very important in my country because we have such a large Indigenous population and diverse cultures, but also and professional workers. And we think if we had about a third each of those, that would be a good situation. Big psychiatry has a legacy of paternalism and human rights breaches. You read anything about the history of psychiatry, it is appalling, some of the things that happened and some of the things that still happen in psychiatry. Whereas in big community, we're talking about a commitment to partnerships and human rights. So in my country, there is an awful lot of risk management in psychiatry. So if I was a psychiatrist and I'd spent 12 years to become a psychiatrist, through medical school and specialist training. And my job was just to lock people up and try and give them there's only about 5 types of medication in psychiatry. I would feel very dissatisfied with that. I don't think it's a great job. I think I'd rather drive a bus. But anyway, the big focus is on managing risk, and really in big community we need to think about a focus on access, strength, and thinking about people's life outcomes, not about the immediate risk so much, but about what is the greater risk of treating this person in psychiatry, because as soon as you walk through the door of a mental health service, your status in the world goes down and your chances in life reduce, and that is not good. So big psychiatry responds to risk with coercion and compulsory treatment. And we need to respond to risk in big community with compassion and more intensive support. And of course, big psychiatry in New Zealand is seen by the Māori people as part of the whole colonising infrastructure that the Europeans brought to New Zealand. And in big community, we need to absorb that there are very different ways of looking at these things, including Indigenous ways of looking at distress. Now, in New Zealand, I think we are... Is it showing? We are not very far on the road to big community. And the Wellbeing Manifesto is really saying, how do we get from big psychiatry to big community? So we start with the 7 wellbeing priorities. All people in their whānau, which is the people important to them, they live in social conditions that sustain their well-being. Because we know that we all have a parcel of genes in us, but the social conditions we live in have a profound impact on the outcomes in our life. We know that if you have early childhood trauma, poverty, if you're a colonised Indigenous person, your chances of developing mental distress and a whole lot of other outcomes later in life are so much greater. I don't know what that has to do with the genes, but there are some very big evidence that there are major social determinants to people developing mental distress. So we want people to have the skills and supports to manage difficulties in life and to have access to services and supports where they can recover from mental distress. So this is the wellbeing priorities. So we want open access to a full menu of services, supports and opportunities to sustain and restore well-being. And here are so today in my country, if you go through the door of big psychiatry into the psychiatric system, there's only one of these responses that you can reliably get. And do you know what that is? Psychiatric treatments. Okay, everyone gets psychiatric drugs, whether they want them or not. And some people are harmed by them, some people feel helped by them, and some people have a bit of both. But what we're saying is that we need much more than that. We're saying we need community and home-based crisis support. We need to get rid of hospitals, I think. I'm very unpopular about this with some people, because the hospital to the doctor is like the manor is to the castle is to the Lord, and they like their hospitals. And so, but we can. I ask people, why do we need hospitals? And they never come up with a good answer. Well, one said, well, sometimes people have physical health problems, so it's good to be in the ward, in the general hospital, in case we need help with the physical health problem. And I said to them, well, would you put all the elderly rest homes in the hospital grounds, because They have a lot of physical health problems too. So this is not we need to get rid of our hospitals. And in some parts of the world, they have done this. Talking therapies is another one that everyone needs access to. A decent standard of living. Support to get education and employment. I got no support in my education, so I never finished my degree. Didn't make much difference, but it would have been quite nice to be able to finish my degree. Family and parenting support. So we have people with mental distress who have babies and they're taken off them all the time. This is really, really terrible. And I know people, friends of mine have had babies taken off them. And look, if they'd had more support, if someone had been there to cook them dinner every night, the outcome might have been very different. So wellbeing promotion and how to manage your own stuff in life, that's very important. Advocacy and navigation through the system. What we talk about is cultural and spiritual healing, because this has relevance to the Māori culture, but also many of us who've experienced distress have had it's a very existential or spiritual experience, and we need support to make sense of it all. Connecting into our community. We don't do very well at that in the current services. Stable housing and physical health care. So, if I go into the door of a big community, this is what I should expect to find. Reliable access to all these things, and not just to psychiatric treatments. So, as I said, another part of the Wellbeing Manifesto was to have a big peer and cultural workforce. Now, by peer, I mean people who have lived experience and use that lived experience in their work. Because when I was in the hospital, all I saw were people who kept coming back in. And I thought this was my life, to go back into hospital, like the people who are older than me. If I had seen a peer support worker in hospital, and they'd said, oh, I was where you are now, I was there once, I was in the hospital, and now I'm doing this job, it would have made all the difference. So very important to have people with lived experience in our lives when we're going through distress. So 1/3 each, we think, and equal status. So at the moment, we just have a health-led system, but we propose that all the sectors that have responsibility for wellbeing, distress and addiction, not just health, there's social welfare, justice, corrections, education, they need to jointly fund a full menu of services at the local level in partnership with the people who are affected. Because we have I don't know about Iceland, but we have a very fragmented system that's not joined up, and people have trouble navigating it. And there are a lot of doors that are shut to people because they don't meet the criteria for entry. And so we need and the way to integrate these systems is to do it at the top, and that is to jointly fund them. But also, we think the services, supports and opportunities need to be based in communities, not in hospitals or clinics, and co-delivered by these different sectors under as few roofs as possible. So imagine if you have a community wellbeing centre, you can go there for mindfulness, you can maybe see the psychiatrist or the peer support worker, you can go there for help with housing or income, or you can have some spiritual counselling or whatever it is, and you don't have to go here and everywhere, you can have it in one roof. But the important thing is that other people, the door for the community wellbeing centre is open to everyone in the community. It's not just open to crazy people, it's open to people. They might have yoga classes there. They might have a GP sitting in there, so they go in and talk about their stress. So one of the things about the Wellbeing Manifesto is that we no longer want to be in what we call in English a ghetto. Do you know a ghetto? A place that's siphoned off, it's separate from the rest of the community. So the other thing we need is a government, bipartisan, so both the opposition and the government have broad agreement, because otherwise the next government will just come and shut it down. So they need to articulate the vision, and then they need to provide the regulation and the resources. And they need to fund social inclusion or anti-discrimination programs with a lot of urgency. Because in our country we have an anti-discrimination program, and they put a lot of money into stopping smoking and to road accidents, but they need to have a sense of urgency about social inclusion for people with extreme states of distress, because the statistics, the outcomes, they make me want to cry. They should make everyone want to cry. So, now I think we need public acknowledgement of the harm that big psychiatry has done. Now, it's not to say that we don't want to blame individuals. We don't want to we don't want to say that is all that big psychiatry did, because some people have benefited from big psychiatry. But big psychiatry has done enormous harm, and public acknowledgement of that is needed so that we can put a line in the sand and say never again. Repeal mental health laws in relation to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And you know about this in Iceland, the UN Convention, very influential. It'll take a generation or two for governments to fully understand the implications of it. They're a little bit slow, but the implications are profound. We need to measure well-being as well as wealth, and New Zealand now, they have what we call a wellbeing budget. So every time they do a budget, they have to look through the lens of well-being, not just wealth, to see, is this a good way to spend our money? And I think investing in the first 3 years of life, because we know there is a lot of evidence that what happens early in life has a big impact on your outcomes later in life. And reducing the social determinants, because we can be as interested as we like in genetics, but we can do a lot about the social determinants. I don't know if we can do anything about the genetics, if there are any. So we need to focus on the areas that we can affect, which is the social determinants. So there are 3 big implications to the Wellbeing Manifesto. The first implication is the end of a health-led system. I now believe that we cannot have true transformation in the way our systems respond to people with mental distress while we continue to have a health-led system with psychiatry at the centre of it. Because psychiatry has a worldview that doesn't open up the possibilities for other sorts of supports. And we still believe they have a role, but a system led by health will not deliver open access to a full menu of services or better outcomes. So that's why we think all the funding that is currently used should be pooled, and then decisions made about how to create that broad range of responses for people. So another thing that is very much a topic in our country is Māori ownership. So Māori and the British Crown, they signed a treaty in 1840, and people ignored the treaty for many, many years, but in the last generation they have begun to apologise and pay the tribe some compensation for the land they lost, for the rights they lost, for the language and everything that they lost. And so Māori are now saying, we need to run our own services because they have more mental distress, they have more compulsory treatment, they have more suicide, they have terrible statistics. And this is the impact of colonisation. It's not to do with their genes, it's to do with colonisation. They have suffered badly because of that. Now, you don't have this dynamic in Iceland, but it's a very big issue in my country. And the thing about Indigenous cultures, there are two things they have in common. One is they're very holistic. So they think in terms of the whole picture. They're not, because of science, we drill down into narrow detail. Now that sometimes has a very beneficial effect, but the Indigenous cultures are very holistic. So this is a very good way of looking at a system for people who have mental distress, because we need a holistic range of responses. The other element of Indigenous people is they're very collective. So they say the I is we. So they don't have a strong sense of individuality, they have a strong sense of community and their tribe or their family. And this is something that we would like to absorb in the whole of New Zealand, because one of the greatest things that people with mental distress say is, I get very lonely. So how can we be more collective? So there are some aspects of Māori culture that we would like to bring into the way mental health services are delivered, or the wellbeing services are delivered, into our whole culture. And of course, repeal of the Mental Health Act is another implication, because if you look at big psychiatry, the Mental Health Act is the axis on which the wheels turn in big psychiatry. Without the Mental Health Act, big psychiatry would have to reorganise itself in a very big way. The Mental Health Act makes people lazy. In my country, we have a very high use of the Mental Health Act. And you can tell they're just doing it to what we call care in New Zealand. And it's, if you look at the letters in care, it is cover, ask, retain employment. So the psychiatrists use the Mental Health Act for care, cover, ask, retain employment. And as I said, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is starting to trickle down a little bit into the way governments think about this. So the inquiry report came out. We were a little bit disappointed. It didn't quite do what we wanted. The government accepted most of the recommendations. The report stimulated the biggest mental health budget boost in New Zealand's history. That was in May. That was the wellbeing budget. And it was mainly for primary mental health services. So what we say for people with mild to moderate distress, people who feel depressed or very anxious or fearful, and who are really struggling. But some of the big issues that matter to people with lived experience were not emphasised enough in this report. So they didn't really clearly signal the end of a health-led system. Big mistake in my view, but actually, if they had signalled that clearly, there would have been a big backlash, a big fight, because the health people would have been very upset. But I think it's time to upset them. I do. They didn't emphasise lived experience leadership enough. They didn't say enough about the peer workforce. They didn't say enough about Māori ownership of their own services. And they were very fudged. They fudged. Do you know fudged? They were a bit murky, not very clear about the end of compulsory treatment. So, I've been around long enough to know that you don't always get quite what you want in life, So we're reasonably happy, but we think they could have gone further. We think they weren't courageous enough in their recommendations. So, these are the websites you can go to. wellbeingmanifesto.nz, where you can read the Wellbeing Manifesto. You can download the PDF. And then if you are interested in the mental health inquiry, that's the website there. And there's a very good video. I mean, it's not in Icelandic, it's in English. There's one in Māori if you want to try that. But that explains a bit more about the inquiry and what it recommended. So that is my talk. Thank you very much.